Well, I'm so happy that there's a good turnout for this. I'm really excited about this. I ask you to fill out, to answer 2 questions. And I appreciate that so many people did that. There were 17 people who answered it. So I wanted to give you the results and just get a sense of what the group is like. This is a short version of what the questions were. The people I guess you would identify who were curious but didn't know a lot, familiar with it but want to learn more, the experienced teachers with flipped, and then one who was honest and said they had no interest but they're required to be here, and then one person who said something else. And this is, of course, a flipped learning technique. Maybe not just asking a question, but a content question, and then you learn a lot from that. Because this helped me. If this had been the very high number, I would have developed it very differently. I would have been terrified if that had been the high number, right? Would have had to approach it very differently. So it gives me a sense of how to target it. I could, and you could, in a class, decide you're going to put people together who have similar interests and give them a separate activity. Or you could decide that people would benefit from interacting with people in a different category. So it just gives you somewhere to go. These were anonymous, so I don't know how to do that. But again, it's just something you can do. It's very simple, but it helps you better prepare and know what you need to do for teaching that day. Okay, outcomes of this workshop. These are my goals. I want everyone to leave at least knowing, having your, the elevator speech for what flipped learning is. Do you know what it is? And probably do you know what it's not? And if you're willing and bold and want to embark upon the journey, I hope that I can give you, my goal is to give you a place to get started on this. So, what is flipped learning? That's my answer. And what does that say to you that I think flipped learning is? Hopefully it's obvious. This is not something you do if you're happy with what you're doing. If everything is successful, then probably this is not something to pursue. So I say that it's an opportunity amid a crisis. And that can be almost a cliche. But so therefore, what might I be thinking of is the crisis? Why? I happen to think that this is a time of great change in higher education. And there have always been some of these things, but I think they've become greater. Ever experienced this? The disengaged, the bored, and it's hard when you're in front of a group of people and this is the feedback you get, right? Back in the 20th century, when I got a lot of experience, some of you are too young to remember that, but we didn't have to contend with this. But this is a new reality of teaching. It's a new reality of our whole world that we're adjusting to. So how do you address that? Can we keep doing the same things in this world of distractions that are right in front of you but that are elsewhere? And this is a timeless one. This is maybe not quite so obvious, but when you speak to a group of students, they are all over the lot. They come with different interests, different backgrounds, different levels, different desires. And whenever you are lecturing, no matter how good you are, you're pitching it one place. And by definition, that is not going to meet the needs of everyone. So this has always been a huge challenge. How do you reach multiple levels? And then I think at the national level, higher education has become questioned by everyone, including our president of the United States. Is a college education worth it? It costs a whole lot of money, and it's constantly costing more money. And there are a lot of unemployed college graduates. And those things colliding together, this point in time, are scary things. And they are, in some ways, a threat to us that we've got to meet that challenge. There's ample evidence that students don't always learn what we say they're going to learn. When they get a credential, it doesn't always live up to what the people who employ them are anticipating it does. So I think there's more pressure than ever to make learning, really, the days of where I'm going to deliver it, and if you get it, that's up to you. are probably gone. So anyway, that's my view, that flipped is an opportunity. But what is it in a most technical way? I think this illustrates the best, contrasting where most of us were familiar with the traditional classroom. And then flipped, of course, is the opposite of that. What we think of as the lecture is done outside of class, and then in the classroom you do activities opposed to doing it at home. But how does that affect learning? Again, I think that this is Bloom's taxonomy, if you're familiar with that. It's illustrated as a pyramid in the sense that these are foundational. In a traditional classroom, what you do inside the classroom has traditionally focused on the lower level learning skills. And then what has been expected of students outside the classroom are the higher level skills, which in some ways are the most difficult. And so flipped, of course, is flipping that by, in the classroom now, you're doing the higher level, when the expert is actually there with them. And then outside the classroom is when they're doing the things that are now, again, the advantage, we see it as a distraction, but because of the easy accessibility of high-level content now through a means outside the classroom. So that's the most basic way of thinking about it. There are all kinds of other ways, and there will be people who will challenge exactly this, suggesting it's always been there. Another thing that's flipped is that you could say you're flipping the attention away from the teaching to the learning. Lots of plays on this, but I think at its most basic level, this is what we're thinking of in flipped. Okay, I ask you another question, and that is how much lecturing is a part? Because that's part of what's being challenged is lecturing, so I really wanted to know how many people were actually doing that. And these were your responses on this scale. So if we say these were the most, at least in the group of respondents, which is highly correlated with the people in the room, then that means more than half of you have an experience of giving heavy lecture. I've spent a lot of my career until the past few years in heavy lecture. And the few people aren't lecturing, but most are. So, therefore, I wanted to address this issue of the lecture. And now is when you've been sitting in groups is going to pay off. What are characteristics of good lectures? So I want you just to spend some time in your group and talk about those characteristics of good lectures. Go for it. Well, let me get your attention again. In your discussion of what makes a good lecture, did you find yourself drifting into what doesn't make a good lecture? And how do you avoid that? So what are some of the characteristics of a good lecture that you at least agree upon?
Has to be engaging.
Okay. Well, that's so exciting because that's my first word. Yes. I think it absolutely has to be because nobody's going to pay attention. It's not. So there is then, it becomes this quality of, dare we say, entertaining. I heard Alan say that, talk to you guys about TED Talks, if you've watched TED Talks, which of course are now, I think, the modern day example of what a good lecture is. Because otherwise, I mean, they get people, millions of people watch these things. So clearly engaging. Something else, I doubt you read my mind anymore, but thank you so much. Some other characteristics.
We didn't talk about that here in this group, but after engaging and entertaining, maybe good audio visuals that go with it too, that will help you get the message.
Okay, right, it has to be supplemented almost with something so that the listener, your audience is not just listening to you talk. Okay.
Organized.
Absolutely. It's going to be, you've kind of got to do a lot of the organizing so that they can follow it.
Related to the real world, give more examples.
Okay, woven in with examples.
Interactive is something else that fits with engaging, I guess, being more interactive with the audience.
Okay, if you, do TED Talks, maybe they might ask, sometimes it depends on your audience, sometimes it's not easy to get feedback in a lecture, right? Depending on the context.
Well, TED Talks are short.
They're short, okay? Maybe that's a characteristic.
We had talked about breaking it up so it's more student-centered, so you can go back to the students and have them do something, and then you go back to...
And that kind of gets back to the, well, is a good lecture then short? Yeah. You can only tolerate so much of it. Organized. I think most good lectures are organized. Analytical. They've got something that's not just information. It's hard to keep people's attention if you're not synthesizing something, bringing an insight that couldn't be gained simply from reading some information. Demonstrating it, sharing experiences, I think examples. It's the method most academics learn from. I think that's a fairly true statement. Certainly was my experience. Maybe for graduate students coming along now, maybe that's not as true. And so therefore in the future it might not be. It is.
Well, what's frustrating is I'm a geologist. I'm a graduate student. And I am a lab instructor as well as a student. And my professors never had any training on teaching, how to lecture, how to do any of it. So we have one teacher that has, blocks of text on his PowerPoint slides, and he reads the text, and the test questions are at the end of the PowerPoint slides. And why would you go to class? Why? So it was just, they don't have any training.
Well, it's not a formal training, but in some ways what you've been modeled throughout your entire academic career is the training that we get. I mean, that's the same. I mean, I pursued a very academic PhD in American history, and so therefore there were absolutely no pedagogy, not even discussed, but I had lots of models for teaching. And I was lucky to have a lot of good lecturers. So I worked super hard to try to become a good lecturer because of that. I mean, that's just what I thought it was. Okay, now, I think a good lecture models critical thinking because it's an expert putting together, I mean, that's really why they're so valuable, I think. An expert who's spent a lot of time in their discipline puts together something. I think there's called The Last Lecturer that's sponsored, and a faculty member gets invited to share something. And if you go to that, you feel like you're being privy to something you couldn't get somewhere else because you're taking advantage of someone's expertise. And they're putting together, through critical analytical skills, something that's very valuable. But then why are they problematic if they have all these good qualities? One, it's kind of hard, as you're suggesting, not all of them have all these good qualities. And they need to be short, 20 minutes I heard over here say, but yet the university has 75-minute blocks. It's probably the most common block now, 75 minutes. And if that's the dominant mode, that's problematic. I came to learn that it's problematic because I really felt like mine were very organized. They were very analytical. They were modeling critical thinking. I was the one doing all the work. I spent so much time putting together my lectures. And then I gave film clips, pictures to illustrate them. I was just constantly making modifications, but constantly I was the person doing all the work. If you want students, which I hope we do, to learn to think critically, to be analytical, to know how to organize some complex set of material, they've got to learn to do it. And it might seem intuitive that watching you do it and hearing you do it will help you do it, but I think there's ample evidence, and the research shows that's really not how you learn to do it. And if you think about what you do best, you probably didn't learn that through a lecture. You might have heard people lecture on it, but you learned it through doing it. And so fundamentally, I think, I'm not saying that lectures aren't valuable, but I'm saying good ones are complicated to produce, and in the end, I'm not sure they're the best vehicle for accomplishing what it is we really want to accomplish. So, thereby problematic. So, that's my version of what flipped learning is. Now, the getting started. And I think you can experiment at any level you want to. A unit, a part of a lesson. And therefore, experiment at your own pace. Probably, it's kind of scary to just jump off the deep end and do the whole class. It'd probably be a little overwhelming. The question is how. And that's the rest of the workshop, is I really want to focus on how to do that. And that was the next question that I asked you to do. You answered the 2 questions, and the other was to think about this. Identify 1 or 2 concepts in your discipline that students struggle with, or that you find that you have to explain more than once. And that's usually a definition of they struggle with it. You discover on the test they don't know what it is. You're amazed because you said it. You might have said it 3 times, but yet they still don't get it. So identify those concepts. So share what it is that you thought of. What are your concepts? Did you have any problems identifying things that students struggle with? In the 2 tables, I heard some conversation, but do you think the things they struggle with are complex or basic, or both? Complex? Basic?
I get both.
Both. I think complex is obvious why people would struggle with that. I think sometimes what's surprising is when they struggle with basic. And that gets back to the lecture. Oops. If you model all of these things, being organized, analytical, model critical thinking, how are they going to do on the test if they're successful? Most of them are going to repeat that. They're going to have memorized that. And you can be deceived into thinking, oh my gosh, they did a great job of analyzing the causes of that war. But really, I did a great job of explaining that, right? Of course, since so many of them didn't get what I said, I'm so excited when there's somebody who did. But oftentimes, when memorization is the fallback strategy, and I think it's the dirty little secret we all know, it's the strategy that students employ, it's the one many of them are good at and they're not anxious to give it up. But when you memorize your way to success, you often don't know much. And you might not even retain what you memorized to get there. And I'm not saying, but at the same time, some disciplines you can't get anywhere until they've memorized something. So it's never so simple. You can't throw memorizing out. It's absolutely essential for core, bottom level foreign language vocabulary, right? Scientific terminology, in history, all of the people. If you don't know any people, if you don't know any places, geography, places, it's essential. But it should be the beginning. These things, analysis, critical thinking, can't really be memorized, but you can memorize somebody else's having done that, and it can look like you understand it. So a lot of what you're trying to do in Flipped is expose what it is, these basic things they don't understand, but it looks like it. Alan leads this group of faculty who are reading about pedagogical methods, and we read a book on how we learn, and we learn in that book there's this thing called fluency, in which you think you know something, and therefore you're done with it until there's a situation arises in which you need to use that thing, and you can't do it. So I think fluency is a common problem in the academy and in teaching. So I think if you wanted to flip, this is the place to begin. You don't have to worry about technology, you don't have to worry about what you put online. You have to start with, what are these core concepts that students struggle with? And if I've been teaching for a while, I know what they are. I can identify them. Now I got to figure out how to do this in a way that thwarts memorizing. Now, the worksheet that I've given you, These are the takeaway 3 steps. And the first one is very similar to the preparation. So, identify 1 or 2 things that you want students to be able to do when they leave your course. And hopefully the things you want them to do are the things that they struggle with. At least that's some of them. That's core. And these are all written down, so you don't have to write the questions. And then, how will you know that they're able to do this? So what do you want them to be able to do? How are you going to know if they're able to do it? Now, if we were using pedagogical terminology, what might we call this first thing? Identifying 1 or 2 things that you want students to be able to do when they leave your course. Yeah, learning outcomes. In the Carolina Core language, learning outcomes. And what is this one? How will you know if they're able to do it? Assessment. Okay. But if you start talking to faculty about learning outcomes and assessments, eyes glaze over, it seems bureaucratic, it seems jargony, it seems like somebody's telling me what to do in my class. I don't feel like those are always the best place to start the conversation. But when you're designing a course and you're trying to think about how to redo things, you have to start by answering that question. And I think the best way to decide what you want students to be able to do is to figure out, use your own experience, what is it they struggle with? What do I realize that they don't get? And of course, you have professional standards, your department may tell you, on and on. So this is not the hardest question to answer, right? The first one, what do you want students to be able to do when they leave your course? And usually, it's a list of things, right? It's not just one thing. Then, I do think this one is harder. How are you going to know if they're able to do this? Because of, again, that deception of memorization. If you give them the answers through my wonderful analytical organized lectures, then if they actually manage to write it all down and study it, and I ask questions in a way they recognize and they give it back to me, even in an essay form, pretty much I still don't know if they have really developed, if I've even helped them develop analytical skills, organizational skills, etc. So I think that's part of why I think that we have to think about it differently and about assessment. If you want students to be able to explain something, if that's the skill, to be able to discuss, to be able to create something, the higher level Bloom's taxonomy, get prepared for what I'm going to say. Will you know if they can do that if you only have multiple choice assessments? How will you know if they can discuss, explain, create? So, of course, then they have to line up. Whatever it is, we figured out, they'll be able to know. How are you going to know it? You got to figure out how you're going to know. And then on your sheet, you can see that I say, how can you distinguish students who look like they know it from the ones who don't? Those are challenging things in any format, and I think that's where working with other colleagues, working in your discipline, because it gets to be very disciplinary. What can we do? Experimenting. You've probably heard of authentic assessments, all kinds of ways of thinking about it. So just make yourself aware of thinking about ways of assessing. Then, how can you reveal, and I think very early in the course or the unit, whatever it is, that the students haven't gotten that skill yet? How can you do that? Well, obviously you can do that with a midterm exam. That's a timeless way of revealing that they haven't yet mastered it. But that's why I feel like you have to do it without a significant grade penalty or humiliating. Can you tell the class? Tell us. Stand up. Well, how about you in the back? Can you tell us? Blah, blah, blah. Those are not good techniques, I think, that make people feel very comfortable. So, and believe it or not, my experience is it is extremely difficult to get students to actually articulate, not just students, everybody, what it is you're confused about, because of that feeling of I'm going to be judged by everybody in this room when I ask this question that reveals I don't know something, and they're going to know it's really simple and I feel kind of dumb And in fact, I don't even understand it well enough to ask the question. So waiting on somebody to ask you is hard to do. And oftentimes, maybe you need to get small groups because it's easier to reveal you don't understand if it's small enough. But how are you going to do that? Does anybody know the pedagogical jargon that would describe this? That would be a technique for doing it, yes. Yes. Very good. It's a type of assessment.
Miscues? That's what they do reading, anyway.
That doesn't sound pedagogically jargony enough. What? This one is formative assessment. There we go. Formative, there's summative assessments and formative assessments. And then I think unless you study that or do some reading in pedagogical literature, those are not the most common terms. But this is what a formative assessment is. A formative assessment is low stakes, not a high grade, and it's a way to reveal what students are confused about. What can I do in the class that will help me right away? They will learn what they're confused about. So, learning outcomes, assessment, and then formative assessments. How can I do this? So, when you're thinking about flipped learning, I think the way to begin is to think about answering these questions. So, I'm not going to let you just walk out the door. I really want you to now work with your peers and see if you can't begin doing this for yourself. The one or two things that you identified, now talk among yourselves to think about how you might assess that. How will you know the difference between people who have this and people who don't? And what kind of exercises can you do to reveal that students don't yet know that? Okay. Ready, set, go. And the 3 questions are on your worksheet. Well, I'm going to stop you again. Even if you didn't fill them all out, I do think if you want to do this that you can continue to work on how to do that. But I wanted to give you some ideas of what you could actually do in the classroom at getting towards these things. One, revealing that students don't understand. It's embedded and understood that they're going to probably, in a flipped format, watch something that you've prepared or you've found online. And those, of course, are oftentimes short lectures that we talked about, all the qualities that go with a short lecture. And in this workshop, I'm not focusing on the lecture that you put online, okay? But it's understood that there's probably going to be some of that, or they're going to read something. But there's going to be content consumption before they come to class. And now, once they've come, what are you going to do with that content consumption? The first thing is that you can never repeat it. Whatever was in there. If somebody doesn't understand, they say, well, I didn't understand that, could you explain it? No, I really can't. Okay, that can't have a format where that's what you're doing, because they learn quickly. There's no point in reading all that stuff. She'll explain it at the beginning. So once they learn that you're never going to get this information if I don't somehow do it myself, because it's just not going to be available in that format. So you just don't use the classroom for repeating something that's been available. They could ask their peers. I say that's fine. And in fact, when students ask me a question, I almost never answer it. I answer it with a question. And this one student kept saying, you never, ever answer a question, do you? I said, no. But you can ask your peers, and then y'all can agree whether that's right, or I'm going to ask you a series of questions. But I'm just not there to give you answers. This is about something completely different. Okay, these are just ideas, and there are many others, and you may have some on your own. Concept mapping. There's a whole set of examples out in the world for how you do this, thinking about your discipline, how you can get students to essentially create visual conceptions of complex tasks, sometimes that are mental tasks, but how do you find ways to lay those out in concept mapping? Fishbowl discussion. Imagine we're in a classroom and these guys are going to have a discussion on a topic, and we're going to watch them have the discussion, and then we're going to critique their discussion, okay? And then you could reverse it. And because they're in the middle of the classroom, it puts more pressure. You know, you can't get off topic when the rest of the classroom is watching you have this discussion, so it keeps things focused more. This is a tried and true one. Think, pair, share. I'm given a question. You think with the person, you think about it yourself, you talk about it with someone beside you, get in pairs, and then share your answer, see if we agreed on the same thing. Or you might discover, oh my gosh, we had different ideas. And a version of that with the clickers, and I've heard some guys over here talking about clickers. I know Alan uses clickers. If you're in a large classroom, they're great tools for getting immediate feedback. So it's really the think, pair, share. But what you can do is give the question, poll the audience, don't give the answer, but probably there's going to be a diverse opinion. Then get them to share and talk about which one they think it is, discuss it among themselves, and then repoll and see if the answers changed, see if they were persuaded by others. And I think people who use this see that most of the time students learn from that format. They give better answers than they did the first time. Of course, I'm sure there are always people who are persuaded in the wrong direction, but it's getting more at understanding why something might be the right answer, and also learning from your peers. And this is a whole pedagogy in and of itself, problem-based learning, but this works well in the flipped format, as does role-playing and case studies. You know, y'all were talking about case studies. And of course, in that context, what you're going to do is give the case study in advance. That's going to be the preparation. If you have groups, it's very important that, well, there are different ways to do it, but one format is to make different members of the group accountable for different things. And that way the group almost can't function without everyone contributing their part. And that puts more pressure on Linda to do her part, because her group can't succeed without her having done her part.
What kind of roles for that when you say they each play a part? Or just sort of an example.
Well, if it were a case study, you might each learn different information about the case. You wouldn't have access to all the information. And therefore, we're going to rely on you to help us understand this component of the case. Everybody hasn't read the whole case. In other words, we were talking here about understanding a problem. Don't give you the information until they know they need it. As they're solving the problem, they might realize, oh my gosh, well, who has access to the policies? We're going to have to know what the policies are. Well, Wayne is the one who learned the policies, so tell us what those policies are now that we realize we need those. And we're going to be all mad at you if you haven't done that. Reorder sequential steps. If you're in a discipline where your steps matter, yes.
I have a question going back
Sure.
to the case study. So as you go into this sort of model, and you, I don't know, I'm not going to come up with some fake thing right off the top of my head, but so you as an instructor, I'm thinking of, you know, your workload, your mastery of the 10 different disciplines that might be involved in a case study. Do you feel like you necessarily have to have mastery, or are you sort of, is it okay, you create a scenario or you give them the parameters of the thing that they're going to dig into, and you assign, you know, policy, law, things that have been decided in court versus law, maybe a humanities sort of perspective or whatever, that you don't necessarily have to know what all of that might net.
Right. And in fact, people who've put together case studies, there's just a lot of work involved in creating case studies, and there are existing case studies that you can use, and that's probably the better thing, is to use ones that have been put together. I think it would probably be too ambitious to think about teaching a course in which you're creating from scratch 10 different case studies. Can anyone add to that?
Usually when they will have teaching notes also, which help with that.
Yeah.
So that You know, if you're using a prepared case study, it's probably been tried out in a class before. Whoever wrote it up writes teaching notes so that they'll say, you need to be ready for this, and they might do these 3 things, and if they do, you got to be ready to respond to those. It'll be that kind of notes in there.
So if you have a discipline, math would be one in which you have to take these series of steps to get to the right answer. How can you help scramble those and see if students can sort out what the correct steps would be? A jigsaw exercise in which there's a problem and you've laid out the problem, and just like flashcards, and get distributed among the group. People have different parts, but we're going to have to work together to solve that jigsaw. Of course, group projects, we know that they're famous for students have to work outside of class on their own time, organize, figure out when they can meet, all those problems. Why not use in class in the flip model? You actually do your group planning, all of your work inside of class, and do the reading, the preparation for it outside of class. And then that way you're better, as the instructor, better able to help with those group projects in that context. And now it's really not an obstacle if you need technology related to that. And if it's something like math, just literally working the problems in small groups when someone gets stuck. Another component of flipped is everybody's not doing the same thing. People are at different levels. So you as the instructor are working with different people. Some might be one-on-one, some might be in pairs, some might be grouped together. Yes?
Question slightly off, but related to the group projects or something of that ilk where they have to be working in the classroom, and you have the presumption that they have prepared. How do you deal with compliance in the preparation? Because simple enough, I can't even count on students reading the chapter. I mean, or readings I put in Blackboard, and I'm constantly checking the statistics, and I see they haven't read. They're waiting for me to explain it. And even when I don't, I say we're going to synthesize. I mean, I'm not formally doing a flipped classroom, but I'm trying to use the class for synthesizing the information rather than repeating it. They're not getting anything out of it because they haven't read the source material.
Well, I think there have to be consequences. I can tell you one thing that I've done to try to deal with that. Grading based upon prerequisites, like you have to pass a content quiz on the reading. I have one where you have to pass it at the 80% level before you're eligible to take the assessment you'll get a grade on. So you can't even take the test until you have passed this, and this is in class. Right, but there's no grade on it, it's a prerequisite. You have to do this. Another thing that I've used is dividing the class into units, and you have to pass Unit A before you can move to Unit B, and you have to pass that before you move to Unit C. And if you want to pass the course, you have to pass 4 out of 6 units. And those things, it's really about how you structure your grading. I was telling this group, I'm offering a workshop in March about how to structure. Oftentimes we have a traditional structure to our classes, and they're not geared towards what motivates students to be successful, because they know they have figured out how to get passing grades without accomplishing what it is we're hoping to accomplish. So I think it's about rethinking the sequence of things. And you don't want to just throw people into a group project. These are all things you have to layer on. You have to do some preparation to get you to these places. Because otherwise, you're exactly right, it's just enormously frustrating. And I think at every table I heard conversations about students in the end that you just are unsuccessful at motivating. It's Christy.
Just to follow up on the prereq idea, I'm just curious to hear, so I think it's great, students have to pass the prerequisite to show that they've done the work, kind of like a ticket to get to class or whatever, but then there will always be a few students that just don't do the prereq, and then what do you do with them? Do you just tell them not to come to class, or sit in the corner? Or
Well, what I did, I structured it where I had 2 opportunities to take it. Okay, the first time you couldn't take it unless you'd met the prerequisite. And if you took the first time, you could take it again to improve your grade. The second time, anybody could take it. Okay, you didn't have to have the prerequisite, but you were stuck with the grade that you got. And you had to take it at the end of class, whereas the students who were prepared with the prerequisite took it at the beginning of the class. Because remember, I'm not having a traditional structure. And there's nothing, and I was teaching at night, there is nothing that motivates students at night to not have to take a test that starts at 8 o'clock. They will do an amazing number of things to be eligible. And there are always a few. There are always a few. So you always have to have a way, right? I have had it where I cap the grade. If you end up not doing this, you can take it, but you can only do it at the end of the semester for this unit.
Does the management of that get out of hand if you have a large class? though?
Well, I mean, I'm lucky to have classes that are around 40, so it would be. But all of these things are things you have to think about what your parameters are. Think about a different creative way. Think about these motivational techniques. How can I structure it where I'm not trying to punish people, but I'm trying to give the incentive, and I get it to where they know that it's going to work. Yes?
I really love your idea of taking it 2 times and the first time takers to take it the second time to improve. I think that's a great idea. On your prerequisite, so is that sort of like an open book test?
No, it's done online. It's
done
online,
and-
yes. And it's on the content. Whatever the content I gave them, then there's a quiz on that content, and then and they can take it multiple times.
Okay,
So it is in this case, Blackboard.
okay. And is it timed or something so you know they're not doing an open book sort of approach?
It doesn't, I mean, I don't care if they do it open book.
We did open book tests to just
Yeah.
try to get them to do the homework.
Well, I don't care,
Right.
right? I'm truly almost out of time. Let me just convince you that this is pedagogically sound. I give you lots of evidence for that. One I want to show you is scaled up. This is a way of some universities, we're not yet one of them, but Clemson is, where you actually reorganize the room around having technology, having group work. And this is what it looks like when you actually have students there working on problems. Full access with all their technology, but they have to be, of course, challenging.
We're lucky if we get a classroom at all, much less a
I know.
restructured.
What flipped is not, it's not a miracle, it's not magic, and it is not a method for undermining you as the expert, undermining you as a mentor, as a motivator, as an educator. I don't think it's anything. So in the end, I hope you know what flipped learning is, what it's not, and I hope you know how to get started. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.